Okay, so good afternoon and welcome to this LRN webcast where we will be discussing the new compliance risks in bribery and data. And now we are emerging from the worst of this pandemic. It's a pretty good time to talk about it. My name is Ty Francis, and I'm the Chief Advisory Officer at LRN, where we believe that inspiring people to do the right thing is the essence of principal performance, which in turn leads to healthier, profitable organizations. For years now, our overall approach recognizes the inherent limitations of rules and regulations in influencing behaviors. In our view, focusing on actions that help and build and maintain a values-based culture will mean more compliance and reduce costs as a result of a tangible and sustainable behavioral change. This past 14 months, organizations have had to manage a dichotomy of economic and health crisis, which has shifted the dynamic of employee and customer engagement, with an almost instantaneous shift to remote working on an unprecedented scale and an immediate re-engineering of supply chains and the emergence of these new bribery and data risks. LRN recently published its 2021 Program Effectiveness Report, which examined how ethics and compliance functions fared during the pandemic during 2020, which, shameless plug, I would highly recommend you read. But what it did highlight was that although 52% said they customized their training in 2020 to incorporate pandemic-related risks, and 47% said they revised their training schedules to roll out their curriculum, nearly 80% of respondents said that their corporate culture has grown stronger, and over 80% said their companies emphasized ethical values rather than rules and procedures to motivate employees to do the right thing, which is something we have been advocating at LRN for over 25 years. Now, did the pandemic fast track these things? Probably, but right now there are a new set of risks to deal with. But before I introduce the panel, I have a few housekeeping notes. Throughout the discussion today, you will see a Q&A little kind of bar at the bottom. Please type in your questions in the area located at the screen, and we'll try to get to them as soon as we can. There will be 5 minutes at the end of the webinar, but if you have something compelling to ask us, I'm sure one of the panelists will welcome that. The Compliance Certification Board has approved this event for up to 1.2 CCBCEUs. So if you're building up to your CCEP, great time to do this. It will require you to attend the entirety of this event. So if you do attend and you finish the event, you will receive the certification in a follow-up email. So you can go onto the SEC website and upload your CEUs. So joining me today to talk about these new compliance risks, I have three experts, and not just three experts, friends, brilliant minds in the compliance world. So in no particular order, I have Kortney Nordrum, who's a regulatory counsel and chief compliance officer for Deluxe. As the CCO, she manages Deluxe's global compliance and ethics program, including employee training, awareness, policy development and implementation, hotline management investigations with international privacy. Kortney's been featured as a thought leader in compliance and ethics by Forbes, SECE, and is a CCEP. Next, I have Susan DeBecker, is a director, risk and resiliency at Microsoft, where she works with a team that is dedicated to ensure the world's computers are secure, sustainable, and resilient. She has a wide background from graduating law school, then going to oil and gas, business development located in Asia, managing multi-tier joint ventures for several years before coming back to Europe. She joins us from the Netherlands today. Her current position affords her the luxury of utilizing her experience in understanding the business and its relationship with the law and its sometimes conflicting bedfellow, which is compliance. And that's it. Oh, last but not least, we have Cordery's legal compliance guru, Jonathan Armstrong, an experienced lawyer based in London with his concentration on compliance and technology. His practice includes advising multinational companies on risk and compliance across Europe, but he's been particularly active in advising multinational corporations on the response to GDPR and changing data transfer environment. In 2020, Jonathan was featured by Analytica in their Who's Who of Cybersecurity report as one of the world's top 100 influencers in cybersecurity. But my favorite is that Jonathan is listed as a super lawyer and has been listed in Legal Experts from 2002 to date. So welcome everyone. Welcome everyone viewing in from the US and outside of the US. So good morning, good evening, and good afternoon. So we've talked about what these new risks are, and we can talk about how we prepare our workforce to go back out into the world and do what they did 14 months ago. But the bigger question is, what should we not do? So, Jonathan, I'll let you kick this one off.
Yeah, well, borrowed time. Thanks very much for the kind introduction. I think that you've alluded to it already. I think one of the things that has worked well during the pandemic is that in the main, for most organizations, certainly in the first few months of the pandemic, our employees were on board and they all worked together with the common goal of keeping each other safe, looking after each other, checking in on people, and also making sure that the company was in good health as well as people were individually. And I think in some respects, we saw the very best of human behavior at the start of the pandemic. My gut feel, without being negative, is that in some businesses, we're starting to see the worst of human behavior as we move out of the pandemic. And I can remember when I was first made a partner in a law firm and then I resigned soon afterwards, I got a lecture from the senior partner about loyalty to the firm. And I got that lecture. One of the reasons that I'd resigned is that they'd dismissed the wills and probate team without notice. And I was saying, loyalty cuts both ways. And I think that's true also of the way in which we treat people during the pandemic and coming out. The worst example I could give you would be West Midlands Trains. They unfortunately had one colleague die due to COVID through manning the trains to get NHS workers to work. A number of them were seriously ill, and somebody somewhere thought it was a great idea to send a phishing test email to all employees to say, we've all had a hard time during the pandemic, so we're going to give you a one-off financial bonus to thank you for everything that you've gone through. And if they clicked on to accept the bonus, they got an email saying that they were a dumb person for clicking on a phishing link. Hugely insensitive when some of those employees had lost a work colleague who gave his or her life through getting nurses to work. The email itself said, this gift will inspire you to keep up the good work. Very emotive language, and it was a phishing attempt. And not only is that hugely insensitive, but also I think it does the business a disservice. Whenever compliance has an us versus them mentality, they lose. Because in any business, even if you're Barclays Bank with hundreds of compliance officers, there are more than them than there are of the us. And you need everyone in the business to be your eyes and ears to look out for bad things happening. And particularly in phishing, you need them to be your eyes and ears and tell people they trust as soon as they see something that doesn't look right. And so I think a lot of businesses now, the good clients that we see have done planning for going into the pandemic, and now they're doing planning for coming out of it, because the world isn't going to be the same. We are going to have hybrid working, all sorts of different models going forward, and you have to properly plan going in, properly plan going out. And in some respects, more so going out, because people will cut you slack going into a pandemic. We've seen that from individuals, from employees, from regulators. They won't cut you as much slack going out, particularly if you send insensitive emails like West Midlands Trains did.
That's interesting. And we had a conversation just late last week when I was in New York, and Susan, you kind of put the shivers up me now checking every single email I have of my bank. But luckily my bank doesn't have an A in it. But you gave us a great example of a spoofing email you got not so long ago. And I wonder if you want to kind of elaborate on that.
This one, so yeah, I'm in compliance the same as the rest of us and many of the people that are on the call. And, sometimes we sort of thumb our noses a little bit because we like to think we know. I kind of, welcome, bring on the phishing email. I'm going to catch you out because you're not going to get me. I'm used to you. So this one actually did nail me, and it really gave me pause for thought. Most people, I don't know if you remember or if you can go back that far. If you've got kids, you'll understand. When you teach a kid to write script, you teach them to write an A. You know, it's like an O with a tail. That's an A. And then as you get older, you get capitals and stuff like that. Just think about the O with the tail. But if you actually go and do a URL or something, the A is usually sort of like a snake with a little bubble, right? It's that one. And I'm going to use the example of it's a bank, or I can use an American example, which is great. Wells Fargo, right? And Wells Fargo, it's easy. And you see www.wellsfargo.com and you think, okay, and is this a phishing email? What am I looking at? We could be hacked here. No, it's and it's HTTPS, right? Totally secure, wellsfargo.com. I'm okay, I'm safe, I can go in, I click the link, no problem. It looks like Wells Fargo. It says Wells Fargo, there's no, dot something else in there, and you carry on. And what it transpired to be is that just by changing that letter A from the one that is normally what we use in Western script to the one with the circle with the tail was the phishing. And I got totally caught. I got the you being caught out here email. And I thought that was absolutely one of the best. I hate to say it this way, but it was one of the best. And it made me think, the more we come out of the pandemic, what we have seen through the pandemic is people's innovation to be able to get around things. When it comes to scamming and phishing and all the other ishings there are. And this is just yet another one. And so from a compliance perspective, we really have to be far more vigilant, especially if it is something as simple as the letter A. I mean, that horrified me.
So, Kortney, joining us from Minnesota, how should senior leadership, IT departments deal with this, but in a human way? I mean, how should we be adapting our social behavior?
So I think the key there is in a human way. We as compliance officers can build our safety lasagna, layers after layers of safety and control. And then if we don't talk to people as humans and teach them as humans what to do and how to make choices, then it's all for naught, because we have to give people the tools to be able to make good choices. We can't turn everyone into a lawyer. We can't turn everyone into a compliance officer. And so we have to speak to people on a level that they understand as other people. And I think that that's really key, particularly as we've gone mostly digital. I know now many places are starting to open up, at least in the US. But the human interaction element is key, because the last thing people want is to have to watch another video that's been assigned by someone in corporate. They don't want to take another training. They don't want to read another newsletter. They want someone to give them tools. They want people to speak to them and their needs. And it's a really good opportunity, I think, for just-in-time training, as well as really just engaging your workforce in a different way. So when I talk about just-in-time training, one of the key things that I love about it is that you're not relying on anyone to do something, to remember something hard. You're putting up, my favorite just-in-time training is in every washroom I've been in, I think in the last decade. And it says employees must wash hands before returning to work. And what it is it's there to remind you that you need to do something. And most of the time, yes, you're probably going to remember to do it on your own, but you may also not remember. And so it's there as a backup. And so it's really a way to understand that humans are fallible and make mistakes. And sometimes we just have too many things in our brain to be able to recall off the top of our heads what we need to do at a particular time. And so try to make, there's a concept called the pit of success. I don't know if you guys are familiar with it, but it's basically you create a system where the default is successful. So you fall into the pit of success. Instead of having to walk up the mountain to meet and be successful, just walking along, you fall into what we need and want you to do. And so that, from a human perspective, is how I like to think about training, think about talking to our workforce, and think about protecting our organization. Make the default success.
So, you mentioned us being more fallible now and the fragility that we're feeling because of the pandemic, but Susan, surely this is what bad actors are looking for, right?
Yeah, I mean, this is part of the problem that everybody listening is most likely aware of. I mean, coming out of this, there is a lot more bad actors, and they're a lot more visible too. And I call it the snake eating the tail. Everybody's trying to survive coming out of this. And so there is a lot more pressure on people. Kortney spoke earlier about how she's looking at the training programs. And I would add one thing, Kortney, I think we've spoken about it before. We need to treat people like grown-ups. Yeah. I mean, we tend to forget that they manage to get dressed and get to work in the morning. I mean, I think we can treat them as grown-ups. So we have to remember that. And life's lessons, it's not just all about ticking the box to say that I have a new rule, because you know what people are like. I'm supposed to do 60 miles an hour on the road. I can guarantee you, as a compliance person, I don't. So, everybody's the same way, but they're taking care. They're bad actors are everywhere, and they're going to take advantage of the people who are hit hardest. Those of you who have salespeople or procurement people who can be easily influenced, these are the people sometimes that really that they come under that extra pressure, and they're going to attack those areas. So as compliance people, please start to think about reaching out into those areas that aren't so covered sometimes. Salespeople, are there covered. Sales and marketing is a heavy coverage. But what about procurement? What about HR? What about those areas that aren't normally covered? Because they're going to think they're doing things the right way. And what we want to do is we want to say, yeah, it was really nice that you think that by giving Joe's sister a leg up, by giving her that contract was, a good idea, Mr. Procurement person. Not a bad idea, but you went around the system. We didn't look at the rules. We didn't look at the regulations, and they're there for a reason. Not because we just stuck a rule in because we thought it looked good, but because there is a reason behind it. And you usually find when you talk to people that they will get on board with the fact of, oh, now I understand why that's there. I don't like it, but I understand it. And that's fine with me. You don't have to like everything that we're telling you, but it's there for a reason. So when you look at that fragility of where we are at the moment, when you look at these bad actors coming after us, they're out there and they're coming after us, and they're coming after the weaker parts of our organization. So think outside the box now. Don't just think, well, the pandemic's over, business is normal, here we go. No, it's not going to work like that.
So in some respects, sorry, Ty, I was just going to say that in some respects, that from what I've seen across my desk, they've actually got better during the pandemic. Yeah. There's a case study in Italy about how the mafia was better prepared for COVID than the Italian government, and organized crime can mutate and amend what it does very rapidly. And also those who are taking petty bribes. All of us have procured things, I think, during the pandemic, like the Cordery sanitizer that we haven't ever procured before. I've followed UK government Air Force aircraft going to Turkey for PPE and coming back empty-handed. So there's all sorts of bribery risk. And I think equally from a data security risk, we're seeing particularly a lot of the Russian gangs be very, very good at understanding the way people work during the pandemic. You know, attacks that are timed to come into that time that you would have been commuting, but most of our employees are working those extended hours. And that's when they're vulnerable, and they haven't got that check and balance in the office, like I think you said, Kortney. So a lot of employees, you know, would have somebody next to them at the next workstation, clever Sandra or whatever, would say, Sandra, this looks a bit of a difficult link. Should I click on it? And Sandra would say, of course not. But we're seeing relatively senior employees, you know, one client, number 3 in the organization, clicked on a phishing link, and the net was that they lost a month's worth of expenditure. So a month's payments were made to two on 2 invoices. You know, a large amount of money which they could ill afford to lose during the pandemic, just through somebody senior in the organization clicking. And maybe just to pick up one last point, if I could, is we have to get out of this pattern of training people in yesterday's risks. Yeah. And I think what you said about just-in-time training is absolutely relevant, but just-in-time training tailored to the threat in time as well. So, you know, a lot of phishing training, we're teaching people not to click on emails from Nigerian princes to free astronauts from the Soyuz space station. You know, that attack came and went 12 years ago. Let's teach people not to answer emails from headhunters and download job descriptions or whatever today's threat is, not the threat of 12 years ago. Because you get into the situation where when I ask the number 3 in the organization why he clicked on the link, he said, no Nigerian princes were mentioned. So I knew it couldn't be phishing, because the phishing training had told him that phishing emails come from Nigerian princes, which they don't.
And I think
sorry,
I think it's important to note that without sounding defeatist, the bad guys are always going to be a step ahead of us. They're always going to have a new plan and a new play. And in the last, I'd say, couple of years, but particularly during the pandemic, it seems like the hacks have gone from more corporate-wide, we're going to hack in and steal all your data, into smaller targets. So we're using social engineering to target the CFO. We're going to target this mid-level person who can approve invoices, or this procurement professional. And so they're targeting based on where you are in an organization and what you can do with the power you have in your role. And I think that kind of social engineering is going to be more and more pervasive. So we've got the ransomware attacks that they're just locking important organizations out of their data. But when they're trying to make, when they're trying to now kind of hack without ransomware, it is very targeted. It's not the CEO. It's someone who isn't going to be as aware or as sophisticated when looking for risks.
One of the best I saw, sorry, Ty, just to illustrate that, was an organization that they're US owned. The first spoof email went to a female member of staff, relatively junior, said, I love the dress you're wearing today. Second email said, another great blouse you've got on today, Sharon. The third email said something like, another stunning outfit, maybe undo the button a bit. And of course, HR went and tapped the CFO on the shoulder and said, look, these emails are inappropriate. He says, what emails? They say, look, Sharon doesn't like these emails. She feels threatened by them. We're going to suspend you whilst we investigate. He says, nothing to do with me, nothing to do with me. And of course, the gang have his credentials whilst he's at home and locked out of the system being investigated. Of course, it was the gang who sent those emails, and they empty the bank account whilst he's sat at home, because he's the one who's the check and balance. So compliance lasagna, definitely there's still a need for that. We need those multiple layers in the organization that are checking on things, and we oughtn't to take stuff at face value, because these gangs are super sophisticated, and many of them have the ability to micro target, and they work a bit like a Tupperware party, where there's a central product and then home groups using different techniques to sell that product. And you're right. I mean, if they do 2,000 phishing attacks on your organization, they only need to get lucky once. You need to get lucky 2,000 times.
I think to add to that, I wanted to make a point. It really doesn't matter where you sit in the world. So Jonathan, you're in London, and Kortney, you're in the States. It really doesn't matter, because we've proved without a doubt that you can work from anywhere. You can work from behind your computer, and your computer can be on the moon for anybody knows. So please don't start putting borders up and saying, well, we're in the UK, it can't happen to us, or we're in the US, it can't happen to us. It can, and it's going to. And we've all seen examples of it very recently, that horrible example in the US of the ransomware for your terminal in the fuel terminal, which completely wreaked havoc. Because of whatever reasons behind there, and I don't know them, but it completely wreaked havoc. And that's what people do, because they want to get something from you, and that's what it's all about. But I would imagine, and I'd actually put money on it, that when you look at it at the end of the day, and we'll never know because we'll never find the detail, but I would put money on it that it would start at the lower level. The people that we don't normally have those discussions with, to explain to them why certain things are so important. And then it flowed from there.
So let's talk about this, because, I wanted to ask a question earlier, but Jonathan, you answered it for me. So let's talk about this data and how we protect it. I mean, there are a ton of new laws out there, directives, just waiting to be enacted. But more importantly, how are they going to be interpreted now? Because we've spent the last year and a half finding shortcuts to use them, but now I guess they're going to need to be reversed.
I think that's definitely right. I think a number of, we've seen a lot of what you might call COVID-related data breaches, and that's been, the relatively trivial, for example, one executive using a foreign computer, i.e. not one that was company issued, a senior employee, the organization asks him what's happening, and he says, well, his new company issued laptop is really quick, and his wife has a stressful job and she's very stressed, so he's given her the work laptop and he's using the kids' computer for work. This obviously we forget that our employees have got all sorts of things going on in their personal lives and home lives as well. The common issue that we see at the moment actually is people who have changed their IT systems to allow for home printing. And that's either to connect a printer up, and people have worked out they can connect up other devices, or one of the most absurd, I think, that we've seen, which is where a CEO of a business is using his wife as his secretary during COVID. So he emails her instructions from the corporate account to his wife's Gmail account, and she's apparently sat in the same office, but very sensitive stuff. They're a listed entity. He's sending pre-stock exchange announcement data, et cetera, et cetera. I should say he's the former CEO, and read into that what you will. And but I think a lot of people have devised their own workarounds. And so what we've done with some clients is we've shelf-lifed some of these processes. So we've said, okay, you do need to do this for X months whilst you get a home printer out to anybody, or whilst you get a shredder out to people, or whatever that might be. You might need to do that for a number of weeks or months or whatever. but let's keep a handle on it. Let's look at these exceptions and let's make them exceptions and say, we're going to review this in 6 weeks time or 2 weeks time or whatever. And there's no excuse really, you know, hard copy documents. We see a lot of issues around hard copy documents. Some regulators, like the Polish regulator, are very driven on that. But we've got to look at this whole data hygiene situation. And I think we've got to work out the fact that, as I've said, in the early days of the pandemic, I think most employees were on side. My suspicion is since September, October, November time, some good people turned bad, if you like. Some people are worried about their future. They're extracting customer lists, they're extracting pricing data, etc., because they're looking for their next role now, and businesses have to tighten up on that as a result.
But I guess the answer to that is going to be from the hundreds of thousands of people who are now at home working from home, and they'll say, well, you know, what's the harm? You know, I'm just asking my partner, wife, husband to just check over a marketing deck. Susan, what's the harm?
Yeah, and that's actually a question I've heard repeated several times, because again, I go back to people don't understand because we haven't told them. We've spoken, we've thrown things at people. We've said, don't do this, don't do that, don't do this, don't do that. We haven't actually explained why certain things are important. So people, you'll find, mostly try to do things with the best intentions. They don't mean to cause the problem, but they do. And so then when they create the problem, the key thing about it is that what you do next, you have to be able to step up and say, okay, look, made a mistake. How do we solve this mistake? Let's talk through it. As long as you can talk to someone else within the organization or legal or finance or whatever and say, I think I might have gotten something wrong here. They can come to you as a compliance person. You then deal with it. What you don't is then sort of start wagging the finger like, the parent, you did a bad thing. You have to say, okay, totally understand why you did this, but now let's work out why you shouldn't. Let me show you the path of what happens. And then you'll also find that local authorities and the DOJ even will look at it more favorably. I'm not going to say they're going to smile because I don't think the DOJ ever did, but they're going to see that it was addressed, that there was an explanation done, and then maybe there was further training or whatever. But we have to act. We have to think forward. And this is part of a changing mindset, because people aren't doing things deliberately in some areas. What was the problem in the guy getting his wife to do it? Big whoopee. She lives, we sleep in the same bed. The printer's next to my laptop. What's the problem here? And it's because of that we have to think about different ways of explaining things. I work from home all the time. This is my life. I have worked since before the pandemic. So for me, it's a little bit easier because I've learned how to negotiate those pitfalls. So part of what I do is with people is explain it to them why the certain pitfalls. And then with my husband being home through the pandemic, I've had to explain it to him too. Sometimes not such a good thing to do, but it's a different mindset. It's a different world out there as we come through this. And we have to be willing to say, I have to change the way that I approach things.
I think giving employees real world examples is incredibly valuable. Jonathan, you've given us some, and we've all talked about what the consequences are of our actions and what does it harm. We're going to talk a little bit later about social engineering and LinkedIn and some of the ways that bribery risks can appear now. But an example of that, I was giving a talk years and years and years ago at the New York Stock Exchange about the dangers of senior executives using social media. And we had a group of CFOs, publicly traded CFOs, talking about the danger of just tweeting, whatever they wanted to. And they all said, yeah, look, we understand Reg FD, we understand not to put any, non-public information out there. We get it. And so I gave an example of one CFO who had been at a Jets game, and it had got to the third quarter, and the Jets were being hammered. And he tweeted out, that was the worst third quarter I've ever seen. Now, on his Facebook, there was a picture of the Jets playing, but on Twitter, he'd sent it out separately in isolation. So investors and analysts were looking at that. This public limited CFO, traded CFO is tweeting out, that's the worst third quarter I've ever had. This entire room of CFOs stopped talking. And I said, all you had needed to do was put, that's the worst third quarter I've ever seen, hashtag JETS. And that would have stopped the SEC coming investigating you. But that real world example of how something very simple can be pretty dramatic in real life gave that group of people something to think about. So, we're talking about data and the risk, but, the other real world compliance risk that's kind of raised its ugly head is bribery. The ways we're doing business, the way we're kind of exercising ourselves and communicating with people. So, Susan, I'd like you to talk a little bit about what Microsoft is doing and how it's changing its focus. Because you mentioned recently about how procurement is now becoming an emerging risk for bribery. I mean, how is that happening?
Well, I can't speak directly for Microsoft because that's not my focus at the moment in time, but I can speak generally across the top of where I came from, which was Cisco, and partly what I'm seeing with Microsoft as well. But it goes to the very essence of what we know in our field as compliance officers. And it's what I spoke about earlier and Kortney spoke about as well, which is where you see the snake eating the tail. The pressure is on the people in procurement. Let's use procurement as the example. So you've got the suppliers, the little suppliers have been eaten by the big suppliers, or the little supplier who has managed to hang on. He's going to go to that procurement guy who's been sitting in that back office for months, who's now at home. And he's going to offer him every deal in the world to take his product or service. And it's going to be, and the procurement guys probably never had that level before because the levels will raise, the incentives will raise for us to take these wonderful things. And he's never had that before because he was sitting next to Sandra at the back of the office. Now he's at home and he's thinking, well, who's going to know? It's a couple of tickets to the Jets game in the skybox, huh? This is kind of cool. Who's going to know that? Nobody's going to know it. And it's little things like that that will start to get us. And that's where you're going to see in areas like procurement and other areas where things will start to happen. And it'll start to then scale out from there. So you'll start to see what I call the infestation will come. Now that's from areas that we never thought about earlier, where we wouldn't have really targeted procurement to speak of, or HR. Let's think about those areas you don't normally go for. And those are the ones that we have to, as compliance experts, start to think about. Spend your time looking around, take the blinkers off. It's not just sales and marketing. It is these other areas that need to look at those areas for your third parties are coming after you. So be aware of it. Kortney, I think you actually were speaking about that as well, especially around tariffs.
Right. So in the US, the previous administration put in tariffs against China that increased the cost of products procured from China 20 to 25% kind of across the board. And I don't think it's a secret that many things are procured from China because it is cost effective to get things from China or Southeast Asia or Asia generally. And so when the tariffs went into play, one of the things that we noticed was that there were big pushes to move procurement out of China and into countries that are equally cost effective, but weren't subject to the tariffs. So I'm thinking Vietnam was one of the countries, Indonesia, we had some Bangladesh. So the pressure on the procurement folks and the teams whose job it is to source goods went up tenfold, because not only did they have to solve for the fact that they no longer had their supplier, but they had to then onboard new suppliers in a new area that still have the third-party risk that China carries, because you still have to do all of the diligence. You still need boots on the ground to do diligence on these suppliers. But now your company has completely lost or no longer has an appetite to buy from China because of the tariffs. You're not saving money and you need to go because we need widgets. And so the pressure was on to move as quickly as possible. And quite honestly, everyone's working from home. It is ripe for people to cut corners and to just, oh, sure, no problem, done, easy peasy. You just send me this and we'll sign up. Or we looked on Google and we think Google Street View, it looks like a solid building. It's probably not going to fall down. And there weren't any children coming out, so we don't think they're human trafficking or something like that. Something where people can get comfortable that they've done enough, but it's not to the standard that we need it to be.
So, you know, procurement is now, it's pretty obvious that that could be right for bribery. But what about our chief human resources officers and our chief people officers, Jonathan? Where's the bribery risk with them?
Yeah, I think there are substantial risks there. I think supply chain due diligence, just in passing, is going to be one of the big topics of 2021. We've been involved in the UK on behalf of a client in the UK parliamentary inquiry into supply chain and the Uyghur Muslims. There's allegations, of course, about North Korean involvement in supply chains as well. So I think that's definitely going to be something that runs this year. As far as I think it's relatively easy for people in HR to get caught in corruption. You know, just as we have salespeople looking to make their numbers, we have, you know, petty officials, you know, customs officials, for example, who've lost their bribe revenue for the last year or so. And they rely on that. You know, if you're an official in X, Y, and Z South Asian country, your salary is very low because you're, you know, it's almost like the waitress in bar model. You know, you get a minimal salary and you extract the rest of it from the people who cross past your booth. And I think a lot of public health officials are a bit like that as well. It's relatively easy to see how an HR professional in XYZ location could get a permit for, let's say, 30 people. They'd rather it was 45 people. And the local official says, we can expedite a re-inspection for just 20 US. You know, I think a lot of HR professionals, a lot of facilities managers are going to hand that $20 over, particularly if, as Susan said, they were missed off the anti-bribery training. And I don't think it's just foreign parts of the world. You know, we've had a case in the UK where an employer approached a local medical practice and said, hey, you must have vaccine left at the end of the day some days. How about you give us a ring, because we're only next door. We'll send employees round for the spare vaccine at sort of 5:30. All of that conversation, I think, is fine. But the added bit is, and we were thinking we'd make a donation of £100 per employee to a charity of your choice. And that's, you know, you've got a public official and you're offering them money. We all know on the panel that isn't great. And it's particularly not great when the practice manager of the practice tells the local newspapers that these are the extreme measures that people are going to get their employees vaccinated. So Susan's absolutely right. We need to train everybody. And again, almost as a repeat, we need to train them in new risks, not old risks.
So, you know, Kortney we were talking, you know, I've been listening to Kortney talk about compliance risk in social media for years and years and years and years. From, I think, one of your first panels in SCCE may have been 10 years ago with 4 people in it, to, I think.
When you were 12, Kortney.
We're 12 years old. It was, you know,
right. I was actually 8, but okay.
And you know, you were talking about social engineering, and you were talking about how social media platforms are ripe for bribery risk even back then. So, you know, but now with everyone working from home, and the normal supply chain's been cut off for people. Now they're reaching out to employees themselves. And we had a question on the chat just about LinkedIn a minute ago. So again, you know, people on LinkedIn receiving unsolicited offers. How are you dealing with that? How are you teaching, training, educating your employees as a CEO of a large company on how to protect against that?
It's hard, Ty. And a year ago, it seems like both 10 minutes and 10 years ago, but a year ago, I recall getting several LinkedIn, whatever they call them, in mail from people trying to sell me directly PPE for my organization, saying, "Hi, Kortney, you're the chief compliance officer. We know you want to keep your people safe. Here's a link to getting PPE." And so if they were reaching out to me, they were reaching out to anyone that they could get probably in my organization. And I confirmed with others in my organization, yes, they had also gotten direct messages, not from the same people. And so it really highlighted the fact that they can go directly to individuals. So they meaning bad guys generally. And as we know, there was a whole issue with resources with PPE, but also with bribery issues with PPE. There was fraudulent PPE being sold and made. And so this is really an area where we had to stop and think about it. And what we ended up doing, which wasn't my favorite, but was the happy middle point, was sending an awareness, a corporate communication that basically says, hey, this is a pandemic and we know everyone wants to help. But if you get an email, if someone is reaching out to you, please make sure you bring it to our procurement, because procurement is handling all of our PPE. Like, we appreciate it. And it goes back to a point Susan raised earlier, which is mistakes are going to happen. And you have to make compliance a soft place to land when people make mistakes. So the concept of sunlight sanitizes, right? So if you bring it out into the open, we can manage it and we can deal with it. Even if it wasn't the right decision, we know about it, and so we can manage around it. The sunlight is going to sanitize that situation. We can be upfront with regulators. We can be upfront with customers. But if you're hiding it and you're not being upfront, that's where both your regulators, your customers are going to get really, really upset. So to me, it's about, here are the proper steps to take. We know that people are going to try to come in every door, front, back, and side. And so we have to be able to just say, hey, follow our process. Trust us. We know you're intending to do something good. We know your heart is in the right place. That just isn't the way we need to do things. And I think that that's really important to get across, is particularly in the pandemic, everybody is, you know, struggling in some capacity, either emotionally or through work. And so saying, hey, guys, we know that you have the best interest of this company at heart. We know that your intentions are good, but we need you to not do that, because we've already got a system. We already have our system set up, and we're going to get it done. But if social media risk were a hill 10 years ago, now it's Mount Everest, I think. And training employees on social media is really difficult, particularly if you're multinational, because what you can do and say for employees in social media in the US is vastly different than how you can treat European employees, which is different than how you can treat Asian or Australian employees. And so I think general guidance is always appropriate. Don't make deals over social media. If someone reaches out and wants to offer you something or sell you something, be suspicious. You know, don't make bad choices as far as hate and that sort of thing. Don't discriminate against people, and then otherwise, you know, hands off. But the risk is not going away, and it's only going to amplify.
So, you know, and I think that an important point is that, you know, we all know that rules don't work all the time, values do. And I think if we're supporting our workforce, if we're building a culture in our workforces, you know, we're going to be forgiving to a certain point, but we still, you know, we've all got fatigue. We've all had training and communications and COVID updates, you know, until they're coming out of our ears. But we still need to find a way to be human with our workforce, to say, we get it, but you need to take these extra steps to protect you and the company. And the fact that we've been holding client meetings and sales meetings over Zoom for so long, you know, we've had these strict controls with time. We've had easy access to information. You know, I was telling a story about I was in New York in the office, and my time management was terrible because I'm used to seeing a clock, and I'm, you know, going to the coffee machine, I'm seeing 5 colleagues and an hour's gone, and I haven't seen it. So we're all desperate to get out in the world. We're all overwhelmed with this want for human connection. So how do we protect ourselves from those risks? You know, it's conference time coming up. We're all hoping that the SEC hold their conference in Vegas, and I'm hoping to see you all there and all our attendees there as well. But, you know, like antitrust compliance risk, that's going to be an issue. You know, we're in the club, Jonathan's favorite club, the Golden Fandango. You know, you see your competitors there, you've had a few drinks, you haven't seen them for ages. It's, hey, how you doing? I'm fine. You know, how's your revenue? Oh, we're going to freeze our prices. Bang. Right there, antitrust. So, you know, we can tell each other our policies and procedures, but when you get there, when all these controls are off and you've forgotten what to do, like forgotten how to drive.
Yeah.
Jonathan, how do you protect yourself and the company from that?
Yeah, I think that's really challenging as well. Obviously, in the case of the Golden Fandango, I have Miguel, the barman, as my critical friend to watch out that I'm not sitting down price fixing with other lawyers. But for those of you who don't have Miguel on hand, I think the critical friend thing is probably a good idea if you can get a critical friend in compliance. If I have a client in a particularly high risk jurisdiction, particularly, you've got to watch these messages, haven't you? I give you one example. I once did something with a business in Asia. They're US owned. They got a post-dated helpline report, i.e., I am reporting this in November. I wish you to investigate it on the 1st of March. And when you drill down and said to and the country leader, he said, look, I've got 2 emails. I've got one email from the CEO saying you must make your numbers for this quarter. And I've got one email from compliance saying you must report matters immediately. So I'm reporting it immediately to satisfy this email. And this guy that you're going to sack after the investigation, he's my best chance of making the numbers. So let's postpone the investigation into him. And sometimes, you know, as compliance people, we think, how crazy is that? But this is a senior leader in the business that doesn't get that conflict. So first of all, I think we have to watch numbers related emails as we release people back into the wild, because, you know, I'll be honest, Ty, I had my first business meeting since August, I think, last week, and I bumped my car as I was leaving the car park because the whole experience was so strange for me. And I like to think I'm relatively rational, and it was a bit out of my comfort zone. So for salespeople, I think a lot of them will be like, you know, greyhounds out of a trap to chase the rabbit of sales. And we're going to have a bit of a whoa there tiger moment, I think, from a compliance point of view, to have them to slow down. We've got to particularly look at messages from the top and make sure they're not all numbers driven, not all making sure that they're not telling people to get out of the trap quickly. And then, without it being patronizing, I think the issues with things like the Golden Fandango is business meetings are going to stretch into bars, into nightclubs, because we haven't seen people for so long. So I think maybe even in high risk jurisdictions, simple things like wallet cards, you know, without sounding patronizing, try not to drink too much. If you can't do that, try not to share price sensitive information. Try not to try and do a brilliant deal at 3 a.m. You know, all of this sort of almost the advice that our parents would give us when we were going off night clubbing, without it being patronizing. We've got to try and give similar messages to our people, and watch out for those conflicting messages from the top, I think. Kortney's probably got better advice.
No. I was about to say, even if we had some kind of incentive, some kind of sword or dagger, one could use, which I've seen you in your office. I've seen this. If we want to show our attendees, and I think you've named that the sword of consequence. The
sword of consequence. I think that's your your final incentive to good behavior.
So Kortney, you have got a workforce who are going out into the market tomorrow, next month, in 3 months' time. They all have anxiety and wanted to connect, but they also have anxiety about wanting to make numbers, create these new connections. How are you going to help them adhere to some of your most simple policies and procedures without overpowering them with, you know, hours and hours of training, which will just kind of go over their heads?
I'm going to pray. No. So I don't have the magic bullet or magic saber, as it were, but I hope that we have instilled a culture of values and done enough training and enough awareness that the workforce understands what they're expected to do. One of the things I do a lot in life is metaphors. And so to me, I think of when we're training, we say, okay, salespeople, think of all of your communication, your information that you're telling people is currency. And you want to get out of a conversation as cheaply as possible. And so you don't want to share any of this big, expensive to the company information. You want to share the little information. And so you don't want to cost us money. And so when you share information, hopefully not material, non-public information or anything that would cause an antitrust violation, think of it as giving money to the other person. And that information exchange should not cost us that much money. Again, sometimes I get into tortured metaphors because that's how my brain works. But to me, it's driving home that simple things can get us into trouble. And so I don't want you to live on pins and needles, but I do want you to be aware of what you're saying. And so I think the best, most reliable way of doing that is just having intrinsic values and culture built up through your organization. And the most important thing that we stress is, if you're not sure, reach out and ask. Is there an app that has a decision tree on the code of ethics? Do you have an easy way to reach out and get an answer to your question without judgment? And that's really something that we have tried to force is trust your gut. If it doesn't feel good, if it doesn't pass the sniff test, reach out and ask us. We're not going to judge you, but we're going to give you advice on how to handle a particular situation.
So I guess, you know, finally, we will maybe have time for one question. So Susan, these things are going to happen. Salespeople are going to talk to other salespeople about pricing. They're going to talk about their data policies. They're going to forward an email to something they shouldn't do. What do we do when that happens? What kind of empathy should we be using? And where do compliance and HR sit on those kind of matters?
Well, this is usually where pre-COVID, this is where there would have been a big dilemma. People would have been throwing dummies out of the pram and getting all upset, and lawyers and HR would have all been struggling with it, and the poor person in the middle, whether they had done it deliberately or not, and usually not, would be left standing very confused. I think what you have to do is you have to stop and think about it. As compliance specialists, you have to work with HR. Remember what I said earlier about treating people like grown-ups. For those of you with children, you're teaching them to be a grown-up. But when you're a grown-up, you don't want to treat people like kids again. So we have to have that empathy to listen to, why did somebody do what they did? Was it because the education wasn't there that they didn't understand? Was it because they just got too busy? Was it because they had to make their numbers? Was it because they were under severe pressure? You have to understand the problems. Use the empathy. And I know for some people in the presentation, they're not so empathic with certain people. You know, it's just like, well, that's soft. You know, I don't want to pay attention to it. But we're all people, and we're all struggling to come out of something that was very unusual for us. We now have to find a different way of working. We have to look at different practices. We have to take time to do things a different way. So all I can say to everybody is, looking at different mitigating risks, look at different ways of working, different ways of educating. Take your time and think about it. And remember, these people are grown-ups. Treat them as such.
So we have about 30 seconds. We have one question, but I just want a very quick answer if you can, panelists. The question is, do you think having an app with just-in-time information will be something that is more important now that people are going back out into the world? Kortney.
I don't know that it's more important, but I think that it's a great tool to help. And if you want an example, Ford Motor Company has a fantastic ethics app. Anyone can download it. It is a fantastic example. I'm not affiliated with them at all, but it's a really good example of a decision tree and help you make good choices code of ethics app.
Jonathan.
I sort of care more about the message than the medium. You know, if I refer back to my West Midlands trains example, not only was it an embarrassing thing, but if you clicked on the link, it then gave you phishing guidance, which was more or less unreadable. You know, I've been doing data security work for 25 years, and I struggled with the language. I just wish people would invest more money in the message and the clarity of language. And frankly, I don't care if that's delivered by carrier pigeon. I want clear messaging that people can understand.
And Susan, very quickly.
I support Jonathan on this one.
Perfect.
I totally agree. It's what you say. It's got to be relevant. If it's not relevant, woof, there it goes.
Okay, so, you know, how is not the question, how is the answer, I think. So, very last housekeeping rule, please remember to fill out the survey at the end of the event. Your feedback is very, very important to us, and we'll continue to improve our webinars. Very quickly, thank you, Kortney in Minnesota. Thank you, Jonathan in Derby. Thank you, Susan in the Netherlands. I've been Ty Francis, your host for today. Be well, and we hope you all intend to inspire principled performance. Thank you very much.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Bye.